Hello everyone, welcome back to CloudOpsCraft. Today we are going to discuss about Docker basics and core concepts interview question. Okay, first question is what problem does Docker actually? Here, the interview context will be like interviewers ask this to check whether you truly understand why Docker exists, not just how to use it. They want you to see, they want to see if you can explain the problem space before Docker and how containers changed that world. Okay, so let me explain this question. Okay, so before Docker, deploying software was messy and inconsistent. Developer could say it works on my machine but fail in staging or production. Okay, here is why. First reason is, okay, environment mismatch. Let me zoom this so you can view it better. First reason is environment mismatch. Okay, the thing is developers use Windows, servers use Linux, different library versions. Okay, example Python 3.8 versus Python 3.10, and missing dependencies or configuration difference. Okay, this will be the first reason. Second reason will be complex setup process. Complex setup process. Each app required manual setup of dependencies. Setting up a new environment could take hours and days. Third problem is difficult deployment. Moving an app from one environment to another was risky and slow. Config difference between staging and production caused failures. Fourth is inefficient resource use. Okay, traditional virtual machines are heavy. Each needs its own wires. More CPU and RAM overhead, slower start. So now, how what Docker does to solve this? We need to know, right? So first thing is what Docker does to solve this. First is environment consistency. Environment consistency. Docker packages the app and all its dependencies to one container. That means if it is runs in my container, it runs anywhere. Second is portability. The same container can run on your laptop, on-premise or any cloud, AWS or Azure GCP. No reconfiguration needed. Same behavior everywhere. Third is speed. Containers start in seconds, okay, versus it will take minutes for VMs because they share the host kernel. Developers can iterate faster and deploy more often. Fourth is isolation, which means each container has its own file system, process space, and network, ensuring one app does not affect another. Fifth is efficiency. Containers share the same OS kernel, lower overhead, more containers on the same model. Sixth is scalability, scalability and automation. Docker integrates easily with the CI/CD and orchestration tools like Kubernetes, enabling reproducible automated deployment. Then, how you can answer for this question? What problem does Docker actually? So, since you understood the purpose of this question and what Docker does to solve it, as well as you understood before Docker deploying software was messy and inconsistent. So, how you can explain the question in interview is Docker solves the problem of inconsistent environments and complex deployments. Before Docker, apps could break when moved between environments due to dependencies. Docker packages the app and its dependencies into a single container image ensuring it runs the same everywhere from a developer laptop to production. It also improves speed, resource efficiency, and scaling and automation. Like that, you can. Okay. Question two is explain Docker versus virtual machine in a real project context. Okay, here interview context will be this is usually one of the first questions interview asks to test whether you understood visualization containerization. They don't want textbook answer. They want real world reasoning and how you could explain it in a project setup like CI/CD or microservices, etc. Let me explain this first. So let's take a real world example. Imagine you are deploying a three microservices for an e-commerce. Okay. So one microservices is auth service. Second is order service. And third is payment service. Okay. If you use the VM virtual machines, each service would need its own OS. In example, Ubuntu or CentOS. That means separate memory and CPU allocation for each. Each VM runs as a guest OS on the top of the host OS via hypervisor, like VMware, VirtualBox, or KVM. Startup time is minutes and resources usage is heavy. But if you use Docker containers, all services share the same host OS kernel. Each service runs inside a container, isolated user space, libraries, and dependencies. It will start up in seconds or milliseconds. Resources consumption is also minimal. So, like in virtual machines, what you will have in VMs, you will have hypervisor and you will have VM1, VM2, VM3, and you will have OS and app. This is how you will have. Okay, in VM. By coming to Docker, okay, we will have host OS plus Docker Docker engine, and app like dependencies app together. So this is the difference. So how to answer in interview candidate perspective? Let me explain. In our project, we initially used VMs to run multiple services, but each VM had own OS. So scaling was slow and costly. Later we migrated to Docker. Each service was containerized with only its required libraries, sharing the same host OS. This reduced resource usage by around 60% and made deployments almost instantaneous. So the key difference is VMs virtualize hardware while Docker virtualizes the OS. Okay? And the next question is what happens internally when you run Docker run Nginx? Here, interview context will be interviewers use this to test your understanding of Docker internals, image pulling, container creation, and how the daemon works. Okay? So, uh, let me explain. When you type Docker run Nginx, I'll explain step by step process that happen. So when you type Docker Nginx, okay, here is what happens step by step. First is Docker CLI talks to Docker daemon. The command goes from the CLI to Docker D. Command goes to CLI to Docker D. Okay, via REST API. Second is image lookup. The Docker D checks if the Nginx image exists locally. If not found, it pulls it from Docker, which is default registry. Third is image extraction. The image is stored as a layers. Docker assembles those layers into a complete file system. Fourth step is container creation. A container is created from that image. A thin writable layer is added on the top. Fifth is network setup. Docker assigns a virtual interface, be it virtual Ethernet, attaches it to a bridge network. Okay? Docker 0 by default. Next, sixth step is namespace and grouping. C groups. Namespace and C groups. Docker creates namespaces like PID, net, MNT, IPC, UTS for process isolation and uses C groups, control groups to limit resource. Seventh step is container structure. Okay, Docker finally runs the Nginx process PID1 inside the container. So this is the flow. So how to answer an interview? When I run Docker run Nginx, Docker first checks if the image exits locally. If not, it pulls from the Docker hub. Then it creates a container with a thin writable layer, isolates it with namespace and C groups for control groups. Set up networking and finally starts the Nginx process inside that isolated environment. Essentially, it converts an image into a live running container. Okay. Next question. What is the difference between an image and container? Here, interview context will be common question to see if you understood Docker lifecycle and terminology. Okay. So let me explain. Image is like a blueprint. Read only start. Read only. While coming to container, running instance of an image with a writable layer. For example, Nginx Nginx latest image is the template. When you do docker run nginx, a container starts from this image. So the thing is, image is a read only. Okay, if you do docker run, it will create a container which is runtime instance, which means image is a read only. Okay, if you do docker run, okay, it will run into the it will run in a container which is runtime instance. So how to answer an interview? Yeah, image is like a class. The container is like an object. The image is static, built once, and stored in a registry. A container is created dynamically from the image when we run it. So this is how we have to answer. So next question is, can two containers use the same image? Interview context will be this checks if you understood Docker concepts of immutability and reusability of image. Okay, how you can explain is, yes, multiple containers can and usually run from the same image. Docker images are read only layers. Okay, so you have to say Docker images are read only layers stored on your machine. When you run multiple containers, Docker creates a thin layer on the top of the same base image. Each container has its own isolated process space, network, and file system layer. So the thing is, if you run docker run -d engine, for example, if I am running docker run -d nginx, okay, again I am running docker run -d nginx. Okay. Both containers uses the same base image, which is nginx. Okay, nginx image layers, but they have different writable layers. So writable layer will vary. Okay, for example, consider nginx is the base image, right? In this example, so this is base image. Container A will have writable layer A, writable layer A. Okay, container B will have writable layer B. So, how to answer an interview? Yes, absolutely. In our project, we often run multiple containers from the same image. For example, multiple Nginx containers behind a load balancer. Each container shares the same image layers, but Docker gives them independent writable layers and isolated environment. So they won't interface with each other. Okay, like that you have to explain. Next is, how does Docker isolate process? So here in this question, interview like a context will be they want to know if you understand Linux level isolation, not just like it runs separately and so. So if you are not familiar with the Linux, I already created a playlist for Linux for DevOps. Okay, so watch that to get familiar with the Linux. Okay, so now let's come to detailed explanation. Docker uses Linux kernel features for isolation. Let me explain. First Linux kernel features used by Docker is first is namespace. Isolate what a process can see, like its own file system, network, PID, OS name, all those things. Okay. So, which PID namespace means separate process ID. Okay. Net net namespace. Net namespace means a separate network stack. MNT namespace means separate mount points. UTS namespace means separate host name. So, this is under namespace. Next is control groups, which is C group. Okay. So while coming to C group, okay, it limit what a process can use: CPU, memory, IO. Okay. Together they ensure each container feels like it's running on its own mini system, but all share the same kernel. So how it will be is like we will have host kernel. Okay. So namespace A, namespace A plus C group limit to container 1. Like that, for each container we will have a namespace plus C group limits, okay, which is binded to the container. So how to answer an interview? You can answer like Docker does not create new kernels like VMs. It uses Linux namespaces to give each container its own isolated view of process, network, and file system, and C groups to control how much CPU and memory each container can use. So the isolation is achieved at the kernel level, okay, lightweight but secure. This is how we have to answer. So the next question is, what's inside a container's file system? Any idea on this? If you have any idea, let me know on the comment. Okay, while coming to interview context of this question is, they will test whether you understood Docker's layer-based storage and how it manages the content. Okay, so let me explain in detail. Okay, inside a container, the base image comes from the image layers, read only. On the top, Docker adds a writable layer specific to the container, right? This writable layer captures all file changes, new files, updates, deletes. Okay, when the container stops or removed, the layer is lost unless you use a volume. So, the container file system will be, let me explain. Container file system stack will be, you will have a writable layer here, which is temporary, which means if container stops are removed, it will be deleted until you use a volume. Okay, this is a writable layer. And you will have image layer. In Docker file, you will write instruction, right? Each instruction will create a layer. Okay. Image layer, layer 3 image, layer 2 image, layer 1 Okay. For example, consider this as base OS. Okay. Consider this as a dependencies, and a layer 3 as a app files. Okay. Here we will have a thin writable layer on the top. So how to answer an interview? A containers file system is made up of multiple read-only image layers stacked together, plus a writable layer on the top. Any changes like logs or temp files, it goes to temporary layer. That's why containers are stateless by default unless we volumes. Okay. So next question is, why do we call containers lightweight? Here, the interview context will be, this is a conceptual question that helps you Docker's efficiency to architecture level. Let me explain this. Docker containers are lightweight because they don't include a full OS, right? Only application binaries and dependencies will be there. They share the OS kernel. They start instantly, no OS boot. Okay? Resource usage is minimal due to shared kernel and layered. For example, a typical VM might consume 1 to 2 GB RAM for OS boot, while a container might start with 50 to 100 MB. So the thing is, if you use a VM, then how it will be the flow? If you are using VM, then flow will be hardware, hypervisor, OS, yeah. But if you use container, it will OS kernel, Docker engine, and app. How to answer in interview? You can answer like containers are lightweight because they don't need a separate OS. They share the host kernel. It will start up in seconds, consume far fewer resources than VMs. In our project, replacing VMs with the containers allowed us to run 5x more workloads on the same node. Like that, you can explore. Next is, can Docker run without Linux? Here, interview context will be, it checks if you know the underlying OS dependency. So, how you can answer for this question? Can Docker run without Linux? Any idea? If you have any idea, pause the video and let me know. Okay, let me explain. Docker requires Linux kernel features as we discussed in previous question, right? So like namespace and C groups. So natively it only runs on Linux. However, on Windows and Mac OS, Docker uses a lightweight Linux VM behind the scene. For example, if you are running it in Mac OS, it uses Lima or Hyper HyperKit. Okay, on Windows, if you're running Docker on Windows, it uses WSL2 or Hyper-V. Even if you install Docker desktop, you can see you will install WSL2 also. So Docker desktop abstracts that complexity, but technically it's still running inside a Linux V. So obviously it runs like it only runs on Linux, but in this way. So how you can answer an interview? Docker fundamentally depends on Linux kernel features and C groups. On Windows or Mac OS, Docker desktop runs a hidden Linux VM that hosts the Docker engine. So even though we can use it cross-platform, the actual containers always run on Linux kernel. Like that, you have to explain. So the next question is, what are Docker components? Which means client, Docker D, registry. Here, interview context will be, they checks if you know Docker architecture and data flow. Okay, let me explain. Docker has three main components. First is Docker client. First is Docker client. Okay, interface where you run commands like docker run, docker build. It sends REST request to docker d. Second is docker d, docker d. Okay. The background service that builds, runs, and manages content. It handles images, volumes, networks, etc. Third is docker registry, storage for images like docker hub or private registry. A docker d pushes images from and to registry. So the flow will be user CLI, docker d, docker registry. How to answer an interview? Docker architecture has three parts: client, docker d, and registry. The client is the front end interface, and the docker d is the engine that runs, and the registry stores images. For example, when we run docker run nginx, the client talks to docker d, which pulls the image from docker hub and it. So this is how you have to explain. Next question is, this is direct question. What is docker engine? Okay, if they ask this question, the interview context will be, they use it to test if you know how docker actually runs behind this. Okay, so how you can, let me explain that. Docker engine has three core runtime that powers docker. Okay, that three is, as we discussed, docker d, rest api, docker c. This is the core runtime that powers docker. So the engine manages images, containers, volumes, and networks. It communicates with container runtimes, friendc, or container d. So the flow will be docker CLI, REST API, docker CLI to REST API, REST API to docker d. Okay. From docker d to container d, container d to run c to Linux. Okay, Linux kernel. Okay, this is the flow. So how to answer an interview? Docker engine is the runtime that actually builds one runs container. It includes the CLI, REST API, and the Docker D. Docker D talks to lower level runtime like a container D and NC to create isolated container process on the host system. So, and in the next question is, explain container lifecycle. So, how do you explain container lifecycle in? So the thing is, interview context here. This is also direct question. Okay? This question helps interviewers understand how you view containers from creation to removal, and whether you know the Docker commands that correspond to each. They expect you to explain it conceptually, not just like command. Let me explain. Docker containers goes through five main stages. Okay? Five main stages. First is created. Okay? After Docker create, Docker sets up metadata on writable layer, but the container has not started it. Second is running. After Docker start and Docker run, the container main process PID1 begins execution. Step 3 will be pause. Optional state, the container process are stopped using C groups. Fourth is stopped. System. The process inside the container stops either by exit or error. Fifth is removed. When you delete the container using Docker or both metadata and writable layer are removed. You can check container states using Docker PSF. So the flow will be created to running, and pause is optional. Stopped, removed. This is the five main stages of Docker lifecycle, Docker container lifecycle. So this two belongs to Docker start, and pause belongs to like pause and stop will come under stop. Okay. So how you can explain you? A container goes through multiple states. It's first created, then runs, and it can be paused, stopped, or removed. For example, when I use Docker run, it creates and starts the container. If I stop, it moves to an existed state. The entire life cycle is managed by Docker D, and we can monitor it using Docker PSI. So the next question is, what is container exit code? Here, interview context will be this question checks whether you understood container process behavior and how Docker communicates process complete. They are checking your debugging minds. So let me explain that. Every container runs a main process which is PID1. When that container exists, Docker assigns an exit code to indicate a result. If it is assigning 0, which is success, okay, normal exit. If it is non-zero value, it is failure, which is error occurred. You can check it using Docker ps-a, or you can use Docker inspect. Okay? Example, if an app crashes or command fails inside the container, exit code will not be equal to 0. If the command completes successfully, then exit code will be 0. So if PID1 with the exit code 0 means it's okay. So how to answer in interview? Every container has a main process. When that process exists, Docker returns exit code. 0 means the process completed successfully, while any non-zero code indicates an error. It helps full in CI/CD pipeline detecting failures automatically. And the next question is, what is the difference between Docker PS and Docker PS-? Which is simpler question. So interview context for this question will be, this is a quick conceptual question, but interviews sometimes test if you can connect it with container states or troubleshooting. Okay? What is the purpose of Docker PS? If you use Docker PS, what it will do? It will show you the only running containers. Only running containers. If you use Docker PS-a, okay, it will list all the containers. Whether it is stopped or running, it will show all the containers. Include stopped, exited, and created ones. Okay? So the thing is, if you run Docker PS, it will show only running containers. Okay, if you use Docker PS-a, it will show all containers, okay, regardless of state. So Docker PS is for active monitoring, Docker PS-a for debugging why a container stopped. So how to answer an interview? You can answer Docker PS shows only the currently running containers, while Docker PS-a lists all the containers, including stopped or exited ones. In troubleshooting, I often use Docker PS-a to check where a container exited by inspecting its logs or exit code. Like that, you can. And next question is, common misconceptions about Docker's working. So here the thing is, interview context will be interviews. Uh, they will ask like this because it differentiates the real project experience from theoretical knowledge. They want to see if you worked through the Docker. They want to ensure whether you worked or not in it. So common misconceptions include container have their own OS. It's wrong one because they share the host OS kernel. They don't boot a new OS. Second is containers are virtual machine. VMs visualize hardware. Containers visualize the OS. This is the major difference. Okay, major difference. Next misconception is container data is permanent, but it's not correct. Containers are ephemeral in nature, which means data is lost unless stored in volumes. Okay, image change when container runs. No, this is also one of the misconception. Images are immutable. Renting containers use separate writable layers. Docker replaces configuration management like Ansible. Absolutely, it's a major misconception. Docker complements them. Okay, it doesn't orchestrate. Okay, so how to answer an interview? One common misconception is that containers have their own OS, but they actually share the OS kernel. Another is that containers persist data, but they won't unless you use volumes. Also, Docker does not replace tools like Ansible or Kubernetes. It's mainly for packaging and running isolation. So this is how we have to answer for the questions. Okay, this is like in this class we just discuss Docker basics and core concepts. In next class we will discuss into in next video we will discuss about images layer and registries. Okay, interview question. Okay, if you like this breakdown, subscribe to CloudOpsCraft. We will simplify cloud and DevOps concepts every week. Thank you.